Alright guys, so this video is to give you sort of the intro to botany, plant studies. And this whole last unit is sort of just a really fast crash course in several different topics. And so with plants, we're going to move very quickly. We're going to hit the most important parts for AP testing, and then we're going to move on to something totally different. So with this stuff, we're going to look at the plant A, and then we're going to kind of see how we might see plants appear on the AP exam, and then we'll move on to something totally different. Alright, so when we look at plants, the plant kingdom is enormous. It's got tons of members in it, and fortunately for us, we really don't have to look at a very small group when we talk about AP botany. This slide shows you some of the groupings that we use for plants, and surprisingly enough, plants do have scientific names, but a lot of times when we talk about groups of plants, we don't really use that hierarchical system of kingdom, phylum, all that good stuff. Instead, we group them based on their general structure. So the simplest of the plants are the green algae, which is what this picture up here is showing you. Green algae can be single cellular. Oftentimes they just grow in an aquatic environment, so they're in a fish tank or something like that. Very, very simple plant cells. The second group, a little bit more complex, are the bryophytes. These are the mosses and the warts, like hornwort and liverwort. So here's some mosses over here. These are going to grow really, really close to the ground, and they're going to be tiny. And the reason they are this way is because they don't have a vascular system. They don't have a series of tubes that you can run liquids through, so they have to be really close to their water source. So they just grow at the surface on rocks, all that kind of stuff. Third group then are the tracheophytes. And trachea, right, like the trachea that you have in your throat, your airway, it basically means tube. So a tracheophyte is a plant that does have a vascular system. It does have a series of tubes that it can move fluids and nutrients around with. So the tracheophytes would include the ferns, and then it would include two big groups, which are the gymnosperms, or cone-bearing plants, the conifers, evergreen trees. You might not have known, this is what everyone thinks of as a pine cone. That's actually the female version. These are male pine cones. You might not have known they were there. So next time you see a pine tree, take a look at it. And then we have the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants, the plants that reproduce by forming flowers. I apologize, this is kind of cut off here. These are the only plants that you need to be focused on for the AP exam. So in terms of plant knowledge, they really just focus on angiosperms and how they reproduce when we talk about the AP curriculum. Now, you might kind of remember from a long time ago when we looked at meiosis in the first semester and we looked at the way humans reproduce, we said that there were different life cycles out there and that the plant life cycle was really unique. The plant life cycle is called an alternation of generations. And the reason we call it this is because the plant will actually shift from being a multicellular haploid organism to a multicellular diploid organism. Now, that's very different than us, right? We are a multicellular diploid organism that have an organ capable of generating haploid cells that are independent, our gametes, right? Plants are different. Plants actually shift between being a diploid plant and a haploid plant at different stages in its life. So the diploid stage, the diploid plant, is called a sporophyte because it generates spores. And spores are haploid. So a diploid sporophyte will form haploid spores, and then each of them can multiply to form a new organism. So not come together, right? Each spore itself can become a haploid gametophyte. And that haploid gametophyte will produce gametes, just like you and me, eggs and sperm, which can come together in fertilization to form a new sporophyte. And we start the cycle over again. So here's what this looks like. I think it's funny because the book says this is the simplified life cycle. But a plant life cycle, you see there's a shift between being diploid, which is kind of these pinkish arrows, and haploid, these greenish arrows. And the organism itself is shifting between being a sporophyte and being a gametophyte. Now, in a flowering plant, the diploid sporophyte is the primary generation. I probably shouldn't use the word dominant here because it doesn't have anything to do with genetics. It's the generation we usually see. So like this right here, what you would recognize as a flowering plant, that is a diploid sporophyte. Within the flower of these plants, they have a very small and simple gametophyte. So a flowering plant is almost kind of more like a human in that the primary organism is a diploid sporophyte, and it just has an organ in there that is the gametophyte that will generate the new plants, generate those gametes that we can use in fertilization. Now the flower is going to be our focus here, kind of moving forward, because that's the way that these organisms reproduce. A flower technically is a reproductive shoot of the sporophyte. So it is the structure in which we will find the gametes being formed and the fertilization event that occurs. Now a complete flower has 4 whorls of modified leaves or parts to them, and each of those we would call an organ. And so there's 4 floral organs. That includes the sepals, and we'll see a picture of this better on the next slide, which are sort of the outside part. Then the petals, working our way in, the stamens, and the carpels. And these are going to allow us to produce both male and female gametes. So a complete flower can have both male and female parts. An incomplete flower can also be found in nature. This is where it's missing one of those floral organs. Now generally when we say incomplete flower, we mean one that is lacking one or both of the reproductive pieces. So it might be totally sterile if it lacks stamens and carpels, or it might be unisexual and only make the male or the female parts if it's lacking one of those things. Now here's a better picture and description of these floral organs that we have. Sepals are on the very outside. Okay, these are sort of modified leaves that are protective. You know, when a new flower begins, like you're going to start seeing outside hopefully here very soon, it starts as this, green kind of pod. Those green pieces pop open and fold down, and those are your sepals. Now inside of that we have what I hope all of you know what it is a flower petal. These are the brightly colored, very a lot of times kind of soft and squishy parts that are very showy, make the flower pretty, if it is pretty. So that would be here, kind of these orange things in this picture. Then you generally have several male parts called stamens. And a stamen is made up of a filament, which is the tall shaft, and an anther, which is at the top of that. And it is in this anther that we form pollen. And that comes from cells called microsporangia. So it's these stamens, these male parts, where we're going to find the pollen of the plant. And then final piece is a carpel, or sometimes called pistil, depending on the resource you're looking at. And the carpel is the female part of the flower. Generally, flowers are just going to have one of these carpels. Sometimes they can have more than one, though. But most flowers we think of just has one. And this is going to be a style, which is sort of the long shaft piece, a stigma, which is the very tip of it, and an ovary at the bottom, which is a lot like an ovary in an animal. Now, the way I kind of remember this is that the stigma is sticky, okay, the sticky stigma at the top, and then the style is the long piece, and the ovary there is the base, and it's within that ovary that the flower will develop its eggs. Now, the stigma is sticky so that it can receive pollen, because within pollen you're going to find sperm. So pollen will go from the stamen into the carpel to have a reproductive event. And as you might guess then, this usually happens within the same flower, called self-pollination, just because they're right next to each other. Okay, so if we look at the way that these flowers reproduce, we'll start with the male parts here. The male gametophyte in this plant, remember, so this is technically the multicellular haploid quote-unquote organism, is technically the pollen grain. Right, and so inside a pollen grain, you're going to find 3 cells. Well, let me take that back, 2 cells to start with, encased by a spore wall. Inside there you have a generative cell and a tube cell. Now, when a gametophyte like this, when the pollen joins with a carpel, so it joins with the female part at the stigma, the tube cell becomes very active and forms a pollen tube down into the style of the carpel. So here's what this would look like. So let's say this is my female part here. This is a carpel, so ovary here. And when this pollen grain shows up, boop, like that, then a tube cell inside that pollen grain will start to form a tube down the carpel, so that eventually we can get sperm cells down there to the egg and have fertilization. Meanwhile, as the tube cell forms a tube, the generative cell splits into 2 sperm, which will move down that tube and be deposited in the ovary, hopefully to join an egg. Now this is interesting that it's 2 sperm, and we'll come back to this in just a moment as to why that's important. Now for the female part, again, the female gametophyte, so the female quote-unquote little organism, is the embryo sac, which is, you can think of it as like the ovary at the base of the carpel. Now, the development of the embryo sac is pretty complicated. It has a lot of cells. There's a lot of stuff in this picture that you see here that you really don't have to worry about, okay? Things that you don't really need to know. But you do have to know a couple things. And that is that the embryo sac has a small opening called a micropyle, and this is how the sperm can get in. Right? This is how you can access the egg. And then more importantly, the embryo sac is going to contain 3 cells. 1 egg, you see here, 1 egg and 2 simple cells called polar nuclei. So, got an embryo sac, it's got 3 cells inside, an egg and 2 polar nuclei, and it's got an opening called a micropyle. And those sperm from the pollen grain are going to try to get into this embryo sac. Now, in order for the sperm to get there to begin with, you need to have pollination, as I indicated earlier. Pollination is where pollen gets transferred from an anther, the male part, the stamen, to the stigma of the female part, the carpel. This oftentimes does occur within the same flower, which is called self-pollination. But every once in a while it happens between distant flowers, and if that happens, you have to have a pollinator in between. So you can have abiotic pollinators, like the wind blowing pollen from one flower to another, or you can have biotic pollinators, living things. Certainly insects. You guys probably learned about bees when you were a little tiny kid, that they got that fuzzy back, and so pollen sticks to them when they come to a flower to try to eat the nectar, and then they take that pollen to the next flower that they go to. But other organisms will do this too. Moths, butterflies, just like houseflies, can all be pollinators. And so can larger animals, right? Bats and birds also can certainly have pollen stick to them, and that pollen can go for a ride on that bird or bat until it gets to a new flower. What's kind of cool about this whole process is that we've seen coevolution occur between plant species and animal species. And this coevolution will occur so that the plants can get pollinated and the animals can get the food that they're looking for from those flowers. So it's really based on a mutualistic relationship, right, where both species benefit. So like this hummingbird, for example, the flowers have nectar very deep within them. So if you have these long, skinny flowers, the hummingbirds with the longest, skinniest beaks will be most effective at getting nectar out. So these hummingbirds get longer beaks and longer beaks. What would happen is eventually maybe the hummingbird wouldn't need to get as close to the flower to get to the nectar. But the flower wants the hummingbird to get really close so that it brushes up against it and picks up some pollen and takes it with it. So the flower will evolve to be a little bit deeper so that the hummingbird has to get closer to it. And the hummingbird evolves to have a little bit longer beak, and so on and so forth. So they evolve together to ensure that both of them continue to get the benefit that they're looking for. Now here's a better picture than the one I drew of actual fertilization occurring. But what I want to point out here is a really important part of plant information, which is called double fertilization. Back to the idea from a few minutes ago that there are two sperm cells that are taking part in this. Now here's why that needs to happen. The pollen grain deposits two sperm cells down the pollen tube so that both of them can go to the embryo sac and both of them can fertilize something. But they're going to fertilize something different. The first sperm, or one of the sperm, is going to fertilize the egg, as we'd expect, forming a new zygote, right, a new organism, just like fertilization makes a new organism in humans or animals and things. But the second sperm has a job to do too, and that second sperm will join with those other two cells, the two polar nuclei, to form a triploid cell that will become something called an endosperm. Endo inside, right? An endosperm will become a food-storing tissue for the new zygote inside of the seed. So in other words, you need a second fertilization event, sperm plus polar nuclei, to form sort of a little food sac for the growing zygote as it is inside a seed. So this brings us to the idea of the seed, right? After double fertilization, the ovule at the base of that flower will develop into a seed. And the remaining parts of the ovary, and actually some of the parts of the flower as well, can form a fruit that will encapsulate that seed. Now the endosperm that develops from the second fertilization event is there to store nutrients for that embryo that's developing inside that seed. Generally, when we think of a seed, we think of a dried out hard thing that doesn't really have much inside of it either. It's just dry and hard. But there are a couple of different endosperms that you might be familiar with. Technically, a coconut is a seed. And so the inside of a coconut, the coconut milk and the white part that you might shred and put on a baked item or something, that coconut milk and coconut meat, that's endosperm in those plants. And then if anybody likes popcorn, right, the fluffy part of popcorn that pops out when you heat up popcorn kernels, that's technically endosperm as well. Otherwise, anything you think of that you might eat or whatnot is probably the fruit and not part of the seed. Now, the embryo will start developing inside the seed and form these rudimentary seed leaves. So it forms these little leaves that also dry out for the most part. But these leaves are called cotyledons. So I know it's a weird looking word here. It's usually said cotyledon. And those are seed leaves. These actually sort of take over the job of the endosperm after a certain point. So the seed leaves get to a point where they are providing for the tiny zygote inside that seed, and the endosperm is not really necessary anymore. Now these cotyledons are the major way that we classify two different kinds of angiosperms, so two different kinds of flowering plants. The first group have one cotyledon that forms inside the seed, so we call these monocots, right? Mono for one. The other group form two seed leaves or two cotyledons, so we call these dicots. Now there is a movement, including by your textbook, to start calling these eudicots or eudicots, just because sometimes a seed might look like it has two cotyledons when it really only has one. And so that would be a monocot that looks kind of like a dicot. So if you remember, this prefix EU means true, right? Like eukaryote meant true nucleus. So a eudicot would mean these are the true two cotyledon seeds that are out there. I still like monocot versus dicot because it's just easier to remember one and two that way. So once a seed matures, it'll actually dry out. It'll dehydrate, and it'll enter dormancy within that fruit to stay protected against unfavorable conditions. Maybe it's cold or things like that. That seed has a tough seed coat around it, followed by cotyledons, which are the food supply, that are then surrounding this new developing embryo. So if you look at this picture, I know it's a little bit hard to visualize maybe. You've got a common bean, right? And a bean is actually a very thin seed coat around two very thick cotyledons. So if you split a bean in half, I mean, what you're eating in a bean are technically the cotyledons. So if you split this in half, like it shows you here, you then have two cotyledons, very big here, with this growing, developing embryo in between them. And the embryo has some more vocab terms to know about here. The embryo is going to attach to the cotyledons just at one little point. So maybe like here where I put this little green mark is where that embryo is attached to the cotyledons. So then that embryo has three different pieces to it. The area above the cotyledons is called an epicotyle. So that's more like the tip, epi. The area just below the cotyledons is called the hypocotyle. Hypo means just below or deep to, right? And then the very end or bottom piece below the hypocotyle is called the radicle, which will eventually give rise to the roots. So radicle with an R, root with an R. Now here's what happens when you plant a seed. When the conditions are right, a seed will exit that dormant stage and it will germinate. And the trigger for germination is taking up water, right? Imbibation, bringing in water. So if it gets itself in a moist environment, whether that's putting the seed into moist soil or actually putting the seed into maybe a little cup of water or wrapping it in a wet paper towel, all those things will allow a seed to germinate. And when the water comes in, it kind of makes the cells swell up, like we learned a long time ago, and that causes the seed coat to break and rupture, and that'll allow the cotyledons and the growing embryo to start coming out of the seed and start to grow. Now the first thing to pop out will be the radicle, the little rudimentary root system, and it will start to develop a root system, like you see here. So the radicle pops out, starts to form roots. Then the plant grows kind of in an interesting way. And the way it grows is the hypocotyle starts to extend. But notice in this picture, the hypocotyle is bent. So as it starts to grow larger and extend, the seed, or what's left of it, I guess here, the cotyledons, will kind of get flipped upward out of the soil. So the roots establish, the base, and then the hypocotyle grows and it flips those cotyledons up. Now, when it does this, the cotyledons kind of fall away and become less significant, and you can oftentimes see these in a new growing plant. True leaves will begin to grow from that epicotyle, and then you also get what's called an apical or apical meristem, which is going to be that tip that'll begin to grow vertically and grow upward and make this plant taller. So here would be your apical meristem. At the very tip with real leaves sprouting. So your radicle becomes your roots, your hypocotyle becomes the base, you got your cotyledons hanging on for just a little bit, and then the epicotyle will begin to grow upward. Now back to seeds and fruits for just a minute, before you reach this point of growing a new seed. The ovary, and like I said earlier, parts of the flower may form a fruit around that seed. This is one of my favorite things about biology. Not really, I'm kind of exaggerating, that's one of my favorite things, but the fact of the matter is there's no such thing as a vegetable. Everything that we look at as fruits and vegetables, from a scientific standpoint, they're technically all fruits. So I love to do this. I've done it in the lunchroom here at Mercy a couple different times where people are debating if something is a fruit or a vegetable, right? The classic tomato question. And I love to just sit there and be like, it's a fruit. And they can ask you about any one they want, and you just keep saying, no, that's a fruit too. So green beans, oh, those are fruits. Peas, those are fruits. And it'll drive some people crazy, but based on the biological definition, it is basically a protective capsule for seeds. That makes it a fruit. So there's several different types of fruit, though. A simple fruit is where a carpel develops into the fruit. So the one female part becomes your fruit. If you look at a pea pod, right, each pea is actually a simple fruit. It used to be a carpel. A lemon is a simple fruit, and a peanut is actually a simple fruit as well. Now then we have aggregate fruits. Aggregate fruits is where the fruit comes from one flower, but that flower has multiple carpels, multiple female parts. So like I said earlier, that's possible sometimes. Your raspberry is your classic aggregate fruit. It's segmented, right? Blackberries look a lot the same, right? Each little piece of those raspberries or blackberries is its own little piece that has seeds inside of it. A raspberry comes from one flower, but all those little segments on the raspberry are each separate carpels to begin with. Blackberries work the same way, strawberries work the same way, although strawberries kind of lose that segmentation. They're covered in several different seeds, right? When you look at the surface of a strawberry, there's a whole bunch of seeds there. Now the third one is called a multiple fruit. So aggregate fruit is one flower giving rise to this sort of segmented fruit. Multiple fruit is multiple flowers, a cluster of flowers. So one of my favorite biology words, definitely one of my favorite botany words, is inflorescence. And that means a group of flowers or a cluster of flowers. Probably not real familiar with figs and mulberries, but pineapples. Right? Pineapples are a good example of a fruit that comes from a cluster of flowers. So several flowers would give rise to this pineapple fruit. Then the last thing is an accessory fruit. There are actually a lot of accessory fruits. Accessory fruit means that other floral parts contribute as well. So if you look at an apple, the ovary is actually just the core of that apple. The other parts of the apple, the parts that you would eat, actually come from other parts of the flower, and so it requires more than just the ovary left over to form an accessory fruit. Now the last thing in this plant background, and then in later classes we're going to get into some finer details of the sort of cellular life of a plant, is a comment about seeds and fruits and the purpose of a fruit. A fruit is really just there to protect the seed. It's not going to give the seed energy or anything like that, but it's not only protective, but it is attractive to other organisms. You know, the goal of a plant is to increase its range, to actually spread out and make new plants in other places. So plants can't walk, right? Plants can't move. So they rely on other organisms to move their seeds a great distance, and that's really where the fruit comes in. Right? A fruit ripens around the same time that a seed completes its full development and is ready to go. And when a fruit ripens, it means a couple of different things. Primarily, it means that some enzymes have been released from the cells, and these enzymes can cause some different changes. The enzymes will cause the fruit to become softer and easier to bite into and digest. The enzymes will cause the fruit to start to change color, usually to a brighter, more pleasant-looking color. And maybe most importantly, an enzyme will cause the sugars to start to break down and be freed from their storage forms as starches. And this is going to cause the fruit to be much, much sweeter. You guys have probably all eaten fruit before that wasn't quite ripe, or at least fruit that was more ripe than others, right? And the riper ones are going to be sweeter and taste better to you, and that's because of these enzymes working. Now, like I said, not only is this protective, but it's an attractant to things that might disperse the seeds. So this is a really pleasant picture of bear poop, but in that bear poop there's tons of seeds. So if an organism eats a fruit and then walks a couple miles before it defecates, it poops, then those seeds, which might just go right through the digestive system and come back out, have moved a mile without the plant moving at all. And so the fact that this fruit is attractive and tastes good and whatever, that allows the plant to disperse its seeds a great distance. Okay, so that's in a nutshell a lot of the basics of plant structure. Next, we'll get into actually transpiration and how that has to play into water potential, from first semester. And then we'll start to look at some of the chemical things that plants do as well, almost like plant behavior. Thanks for listening.